Okay, so I have your questions by note card. If you want to add questions or you haven't sent your note card up, please send them up. We have about 20 minutes left, so I'm going to try to get through all of these questions, and so I ask for your help to try to answer them as efficiently as possible. So,
yes or no question?
actually, some of them. One person asked, will we be sharing these presentations on the somewhere? Yes, on the Schenker Institute website. One down. Can anyone share examples of states/jurisdictions that are funding schools equitably and effectively? What is your favorite state for school funding? Does anyone want to jump in or go down the line? Yeah, name.
State.
Just
New
follow.
Jersey is certainly more progressive than most, but even in the better systems, there are always some districts that are left out.
I'm going to punt on this, and it's largely because of the second question. The effectiveness question, I'd be really surprised if anybody could give us a great answer, so I'm punting.
I'll let the national experts handle this question.
Just say not Virginia.
I mean, just in terms of the progressiveness measures, the top of our list is New Jersey, I think Massachusetts, Ohio. Massachusetts also does good on NAEP, even if you adjust for stuff, so. Sure.
Yeah, we often cite some combination of New Jersey and Massachusetts, although I will say Massachusetts, we always make a really important point to say that if we look back over time over our analyses, Massachusetts has gotten progressively less progressive. And since 93, basically, when they made that major reform. And so I think it's worth noting that we probably give too much credit to Massachusetts in a lot of things these days.
Did the up the hill, then down the hill.
Yeah, use the mic.
Yep. So. Is there, this is a question from me just as a quick follow-up. Do you all in the data see a trade-off between equity and adequacy in the state funding formulas or funding results?
That an attempt to achieve greater equity then compromises adequacy somewhere.
Maybe, or is
if
there
there's
just
a
a
tra-
negative correlation?
I don't think so. I mean, I do think we have a few states that are progressive and woefully inadequate, like Utah, where you guys get nothing, you guys get a little more than nothing. Mm-hmm. But there doesn't seem to be a strong relationship because other structural factors make a big difference. Just the income inequality and in a state like New Jersey and the fact that it's carved up into little pockets makes it harder, but New Jersey's put in the effort. Connecticut's kind of a sharp contrast to that. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, there's so many other pieces of the puzzle. It's not clear that equity and adequacy either go hand in hand or go in tension with one another.
Through litigation that these two things go hand in hand, right? One might think, but to the extent that they don't really, often the litigation's not followed through. They don't, right?
Right.
Well, and you could make a scatter plot on our new website of the relationship
Oh my God,
between
no
the
more scatter
progressiveness
plots.
indicator
No one understands them.
and the adequacy indicators, I believe. Couldn't you do that, Matt?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. Is there a funding model that is more likely to be adequate and progressive funding for schools within LEAs, school districts, i.e. is the best model weighted student funding, or is the devil in the details and implementation matters? Yes, is my guess to that question. Devil in the details.
Certainly, from my perspective, and I've done studies across, kind of looking at several districts and their within district allocation of resources across schools, and found that whether districts are using something other than weighted funding or they're using a weighted funding formula across schools within district, we don't necessarily see a difference in the within district progressiveness because every funding formula, district formula across schools or state formula across districts, is subject to similar political tug of war. Mm-hmm. Whether it's deliberating politically over who gets what staffing lines or who gets how much weight, it's still a political meat grinder that the process has to go through to yield a formula. So I'm not sure. I think there are other advantages to a clearly laid out weighted funding formula in terms of transparency and predictability. But in terms of necessarily yielding a more equitable distribution, I'm not so sure.
So you can't necessarily technocrat your way out of the political problems. Ari?
Can I just add one thing to that? I agree with all of that, but I would add that I think the one reason, I don't think it necessarily leads to more equity, a weighted student funding formula, but I do think from like a other kinds of policy that we care about outside of just specifically fiscal equity, I think it's better policy because it gives a flexibility to schools. It doesn't always, it can, and often is accompanied by sort of more flexibility in how you use those dollars. So it's not like all the dollars are tied into a particular staffing ratio, school, class size ratio, which like isn't always the right, it might be the right thing in some places, but isn't always the right thing, so.
So I've done some work in WSF, looking at WSF, and we're trying to finish up a study right now, actually, so I can't really comment on that. But I do have, I'm going to go with the devil's in the details answer, and there are several factors that I think could undermine the effectiveness of a WSF. Okay, one is really how much money is being plugged through the formula as opposed to flowing outside the formula to provide schools with resources. The other one that's just huge is, or I think it's huge, I mean, we haven't dug into this yet, but is really the use, the pervasive use of average versus actual salaries, okay? And that really, it would seem that would directly undermine the equity intent of these formulas. Okay, and until we get kind of a handle on that, we can't expect. The other thing is you really have to look at the formulas. How aggressive are the weights in the formula? Okay, and so that goes, the first thing that I told you was talking about the size of the pot of the money, and if they're only putting through, 30% of their operational dollars through the formula, you're not going to expect the needle on equity to budge a lot. And then, of course, there's the weights. How aggressive are those weights to distribute? And then there's this institutional factor of the average versus actual salaries. In addition, there's also, it's hard to move staff around in a lot of these places. So, you'd expect, even if you were on actual salaries, if you can't move, teachers out. So we saw this in Oakland a long time ago. I did a study of the WSF in Oakland and in San Francisco. And Oakland actually provided veteran teacher subsidies. So those more affluent schools that had the higher qualified teachers, the more veteran teachers, wouldn't have to lose those teachers, wouldn't basically have to fire them because they couldn't really move them around. So.
All right, next question. Which state has improved the most by your, by your metrics in the past 10 years, and how would you explain this?
Well, over the past 10 years, we'd have to rephrase that question to which state has deteriorated the least. And gosh, I'm actually not sure. I mean, for me, so much of it depends on how well off were they before the recession, which then tells me, well, and they all took a hit. Massachusetts and New Jersey were well ahead of the game. Both have tapered off, are significantly less progressive than they were at the front end of the recession. But because they were so progressive at the front end, they're still in better shape than most others. That's also why, like Kansas was more progressive at the front end of the recession than all of the states around it, and better funded at the front, already better funded than Oklahoma, Missouri, or Colorado. So even with what became nationally known as the Brownback tax cuts, even with those cuts, which were severe and among the biggest kind of cuts to state budgets in the country, Kansas still ended its downfall in better position than Colorado, Oklahoma, and Missouri. But yeah, Massachusetts and New Jersey are still better off, but only because they were before the recession. They've both suffered significant decline in their progressiveness. I'm not sure if anyone's necessarily gotten better.
Is an understated story that the recession didn't just reduce the amount of funding available, reduce adequacy, but it also made states less equitable, and it was that double hit of that?
Certainly for Massachusetts and New Jersey that had used a significant share of state aid to raise up low income and low wealth districts. And there are also two states whose state general funds are very much dependent on taxes on non-wage income, which takes a huge hit in the type of economic recession that we saw from 2009 forward. So yeah, they had huge hits to their budgets, which meant that they couldn't just keep up. Yeah, so it had an equity effect, but I don't know that was the same across all states.
I'll just say for Virginia, if you're just looking at the state funding for the impacts of the recession, the fallout, the 5 years afterwards, if you look at state per student funding reductions adjusted for inflation between that time period, on a per student basis, it was about 3 times as high per student, the funding reductions in the highest poverty districts compared to the lowest poverty districts. So it can have that impact, certainly.
And, oh, sorry, the policy levers that lead to that are like pretty, like in some states, it's sort of like you have your base funding and then you have your weight on top of that, but the law explicitly says, but if you don't have enough money, you don't have to fill the poverty weight, the poverty funding. And so when you don't have enough money and you have to reduce, it's not uncommon for the first thing to be cut to be the weighted, the add-on. And so like I happen to be thinking about Michigan right now, so I know that that's how it's written in Michigan. So it's not surprising.
Yeah, the way the cuts were levied too matters. Many states, most states did cuts as a percent of your state aid. Some states like New Jersey did cuts as a percent of your budget. And that actually, when you did cuts as a percent of state aid, it hits higher poverty districts harder.
Yep.
So,
That's what Maryland does too.
right, and New Jersey did a 5% across the board cut as a percent of budgets, which had a less inequitable effect.
All right, next question. Is there research around how much money is needed for high concentrations of need, i.e., what is the formula for, for adequate funding based on need? So I think the point is, like, is there extra funding needed for that concentration, that segregation of low-income students, students of color?
Bruce wrote the paper on it.
Logical punt on that because it's about trying to do models and analyses of each particular state context to figure out, given the range of differences in need and concentrations of poverty and other factors from one district to the next in a state, what do we find in our models are the differences in costs associated with achieving common outcome goals. And it could go from, as we move from 0% poverty to 100% poverty, the cost per pupil of achieving common outcomes could double or more. Going back to a great article written by Bill Duncombe and Johnny Yinger, how much more does a disadvantaged student cost? But it was done with New York data, and we find different results when we do it with data on different states. So, yeah.
I mean, there's no one answer here. I think that there's some research out there that can be done. In fact, there is a really nice review that you and Lori did for National Research Council, right? Which just pulled a lot of, I think it was only poverty weights that you guys pulled from different adequacy studies and showed how those range. However, they're all from completely different contexts, very different states. And so, I think if you want to get an answer to this, you have to sort of do a study that's timely, that's more recent within the state that you're looking at. And I mean, that's my answer to it. So I don't think that there's an actual set answer for that or a target. And this is one of the things that I know it doesn't seem that helpful, but if I'm talking to a state policymaker and they're saying, well, what do these other states do? And that they just want a quick answer, and they want to duplicate what other states do. And I try to steer them away from that and saying, we can tell you what the policy landscape looks like, but this isn't necessarily what you should do verbatim. You should think about what's best for your context.
That can still be an improvement for some states, just.
I want to make a quick point about measurement. I think Bruce hinted at, but I want to elaborate on it, which is that when you're thinking about these progressivity measures, whether they're looking at across districts in a state or across schools within a district, if you want to distribute funds really progressively, segregation is your friend in this sort of bizarre way that if the schools are really segregated or the districts are really segregated, which depends in part on how the boundaries are drawn, it's easy to have a super progressive system that gets, or it's not easy, it's easier, because you want to send lots of money to poor kids or to kids of color, you kind of know where to find them because it's segregated. Whereas if you had a more integrated system, which, and at the district level, we actually see this in states with big countywide districts like in Florida, Miami-Dade the whole county is a school district. So if the Florida state government wants to get money to low-income kids, it's going to have a hard time doing that because it can write a check to Miami, but Miami has lots of non-low income kids. So it's this sort of technical, it's partly a technical measurement point about how you think about comparing these progressivity measures where the contexts are different. But it's also kind of a practical point about this thing that we see as bad, segregation, actually makes it easier to target funding.
Can we move on to the next question? Because we have 5 note cards in 2 minutes. So everyone gets to answer any of these questions. You get 1 word, yes, no, maybe, and then 1 sentence, okay? And if you can't do it, then you can't answer. Does the federal government's current secretary's lack of interest in equity impact measures of equity? Does the federal government's current secretary's lack of interest in equity impact measures of equity?
I hope not.
No.
Great. Next card. OSSI, DC's state education agency, recently released its guidelines for ESSA financial reporting. In defining school-level expenditures, they're allowing single-school LEAs, i.e. charters. They're allowing charter schools to have no centralized expenditures. Secondly, they're also excluding expenditures from private funds. My question, is this normal in the national context, particularly compared against Louisiana, Michigan, states/cities with lots of charter schools? So is this normal in the national context? Yes, no.
There are no standards and there is no normal for the national context for that issue. Jesse and I might propose standards, but that's a different issue.
Right.
Can I use a separate word? Unfortunate.
Unfortunately, yes.
No, unfortunate that they're not requiring.
Got it.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
When are you releasing standards?
Our Maryland report speaks to what the standards perhaps should be.
Yeah, unfortunate that there's no statewide requirement to at least, unfortunate that there's no requirement that states do it similarly across all districts, at least within their state. Advocates could push for that at the state level.
Next question. Education Resource Strategies has a simulator for policymakers but doesn't allow them to change many underlying assumptions. What other simulators do you know of that any state lawmaker could use?
We have pretty good funding simulators for 4 states, which are Virginia, Texas, Massachusetts, and Nebraska. So if those 4 states are interesting to you.
Great. Question for Ari. How do you react to Jesse's argument for using more rigorous regression-based metrics? How does this relate to the need for measures that are simple, tangible, meaningful?
Yeah, I
I
struggle
know
with
that's a
this.
hard one to answer in 1 sentence.
Oh, I can't answer in one question. Oh, I would say conflicted is my one word. I think Jesse's smart. I take all of his points. I think they're important, and I think we struggle every time we start down a path of creating a regression-based analysis at the Education Trust. We end up walking it back and not doing it because we cannot, for the life of us, figure out a way to explain it to the advocates that we work with and the people who we need to make policy change happen on the ground. We just can't. Even the most simple regressions. When I try to create a scatter plot and put it in a brief that I think is so well designed, our comms people take it out and are like, absolutely not. People don't understand them. So, and they're right. So it's a real challenge. I conflicted.
Your comms people and my editor would like each other, would get along great. Okay, last question, and this one looks like a lengthy one. Okay, what about students of color? What about the inequities across race, ethnicity, language, and abilities that are tied to resources and policies that students are constitutionally protected by for fairness and against discriminating outcomes? For example, reform policies that have shifted funds away from culturally responsive equities in the classroom. So that one I think is going to be a tricky one to answer in 1 sentence, much less in a lengthy time. Let me, if anyone wants to respond directly to that, let me just add something, a more concrete question, which is, how can we push the conversation more not just to focus on income and poverty, and but also to focus on race and students of color? And as Ari has pointed out, sometimes inequities are substantially worse when looking at students of color, and the conversation is often just focused on income.
And I would echo that. I would say that Ari really hit that earlier on, and we just have to acknowledge that there is absolutely a political dynamic around race that reinforces or even exacerbates these disparities along racial lines. That's above and beyond what we see in income disparities. I actually have a series of papers we wrote a number of years ago that show that there are, in fact, differences in the cost estimates we get for achieving common outcome goals when we include race factors, which implies the need for consideration of that in formulas and then grappling with, of course, the constitutional issues. So we have to stay aware of race in this conversation, and that's why I thank Ed Trust for always hitting the racial gaps in addition to the poverty gaps.
Whoever asked that question, come find me, because we should talk about it more. I do think there's a legal... There is, I think you're onto something with the way you framed it, as what about the fact that there is a protection against disproportionately impacting people of color. Race is a protected class. I've been thinking about that a lot. Could we create a constitutional sort of justification or like a Title VI-driven policy solution?
It's in Stanford Journal of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties.
Great. I will go read it. I will go read it. So I think, though, I think there's a question about constitutionally whether you could do it. I also think there's a policy conversation we all need to start having around recognizing that sometimes it might make sense to wait for things that, like, I actually don't think it's crazy. I'm not speaking for Ed Trust now, I'm speaking for Ari Americana. I don't think it would be crazy to think about a race-based poverty, or a race-based weight, because if you believe that racism is real in our country, if you believe that being a person of color as you walk through the street, you are undeniably facing structural challenges that our government and our institutions put on you every day, there is more to overcome. And that doesn't mean that a person of color, a kid of color, needs more to learn or is dumber. It means that they're facing bigger challenges in their daily life. And I think it's like affirmative action in P12 or K12. But that is a big conversation. It's a controversial one. I would want, like, impacted families, people of color leading that conversation. Like, I'm not the right person to even be putting that out there. So.
Okay, on that note, thank our panel. Thanks, guys. Thanks for a great discussion, and thanks for the great questions.
Thank you.
Yeah.